Hello everyone! In today's video, I'll show you how I design new stencils for DIY stenciled edges and how I make the physical stencils. If you want to learn how to make your own stencils, then keep watching. First, let me share what materials you need to do this. You need a cutting machine like a Silhouette or a Cricut machine and a cutting mat. You also need adhesive vinyl, and I use the one from the Silhouette brand. Transfer tape to use with the vinyl, but I don't have a brand recommendation because I buy mine locally. But if you search on Amazon, you have a lot of options there. You also need a weeding tool to weed the excess vinyl of the stencil. And you may also need tweezers, but I usually don't use those. If you're designing your own stencils, you also need software to design those, but you can use any software you like. Or if you'd like to use my designs, you can get them from my shop, which will be linked in the description. The first thing I do is create the design, and to design it, I use the software Procreate for the iPad, and you can use whatever software you prefer, but Procreate is my favorite to use, so I always end up using that. In this video, I'm creating 3 different stencils to paint these books right here. The first one is a snowflake stencil design, this one is a cowboy hat pattern, and this one is going to have the new moon phases design. I always design the stencils with the dimensions of the book that I'm going to be painting in mind, because I like to test the stencil before I sell it. I have to always use a dimension of a book that I can paint. So for these designs, I'm going to be using the dimensions of these 3 books. One very important tip is to measure the spine when your book is pressed, because once it is pressed, it is going to be smaller, and if you design your stencil with the bigger dimensions, it will not fit as well. So I really recommend pressing your book first and then measuring. The first stencil is the snowflake pattern design, and for this design, I use the feature from Procreate, which is the symmetry feature. And to use this feature, we have to activate drawing assist, and then we can select the radial symmetry tool, which is very useful to create snowflakes. This way, we only need to create the lines once, and they will be repeated symmetrically around the entire snowflake. After I design a few snowflakes, I play around with the size of them, and then I arrange them on the spine to make a pattern. I also added some dots to make the design a little bit more interesting. Then for the cowboy hat, I only draw one of the hats, and this will be the single version of the stencil. Then, using this single stencil, I can create a repeating pattern, which will be the pattern version of the stencil. This way, I can offer this design both as a ready pattern or an individual design for people to create their own patterns. With my simple designs, I always do this because it allows for more customization. The last stencil is the most complex one, and so it had a lot of iterations during the design phase. This design has a lot of thin lines, so it needed a lot of adjustments, and unfortunately, I also got the dimensions wrong when I first measured my book, so I designed the whole thing with the ratio that did not match the book, and I ended up having to adjust it a lot. The design was also a little bit too complex to be used as a stencil, because initially I had 2 borders outside of the stencil, and they were very thin, and when I tried to make a stencil, the outer border kept moving around, so it really wouldn't be easy to use as a stencil. I ended up changing the design to only have 1 border, and it is a lot easier to use now. After I finished the design in Procreate, I exported it as a PNG, and then I opened it in my computer using Silhouette Studio. I use this software because my machine is a Silhouette machine. It's a Silhouette Portrait 2, but if you use a Cricut machine, I believe you can also do this using the Cricut software. But this tutorial is going to be using the Silhouette Studio. Once we have the image in Silhouette, we have to trace it so it can be cut. And to do this, I select the Trace tool, click Select Trace Area, and then select the design from the PNG. It's important that the design is in black and white or high contrast colors so that the Trace tool works well. I then adjust these settings until the entire design is yellow, and then I click on Trace. Now I have the design ready to be cut, but before I actually cut the vinyl, I'm going to make some adjustments. The first adjustments I make are to increase the size of some of the smaller items. For example, in the snowflake design, some of the dots were too small, so I used the offset feature to increase the size a little bit. I changed the color of the new dots so you can see the difference, and then I delete the smaller dots. Another adjustment I make is to change the thickness of some of the lines. For example, in the cowboy hat design, I use the internal offset feature so that this way the hat is the one that gets smaller. When I make a stencil like this, that will be both an individual stencil and a pattern. I always make the adjustments to just one of the stencils, and then I create the repeating pattern. Even though I created the repeating pattern in Procreate to see how it would look, I always make the adjustments to just the individual stencil. That way I will guarantee that the element is the same in every single element of the pattern. For a complex stencil like the moon phases stencil, I may actually need to adjust some of the vector points. I actually do this after I cut the first tester stencil, because once I have the physical stencil, I can see which lines need to be adjusted, and I usually prefer to go to the vector points and change them manually than to use offset features. You also have a lot more control on the design using this method. Now it's finally time to cut the stencil. stencil. The cut settings to use will depend on a few different things, like the vinyl that you're using, the state of your blade, and the state of your cutting mat. So I suggest starting with the recommended settings for adhesive vinyl from your machine. Before I cut the vinyl, I check the stencil size to make sure it matches the book's spine, and if it's not matching, I adjust the size. And then I finally cut the stencil. To do this, we need to put the vinyl in the cutting mat and then load the cutting mat onto the machine. Then the machine will cut the stencil. The time it takes to cut depends on the complexity of the stencil. After it's finished, we need to weed the excess vinyl. At this stage, I like to see how long it takes me to weed each of the stencils and if there are any parts that move around when I'm weeding. If that's the case, I usually adjust the stencil again to make it easier. For example, in the moon phases stencil, some of the smaller elements kept lifting up, so I had to adjust the size of those elements in Silhouette Studio. After weeding, we need to apply the transfer tape. When I'm applying the transfer tape, I use a tool to press it down to make sure it's fully glued to the stencil. And now we have our stencils ready to paint the edges. I have an in-depth tutorial on how to paint stenciled edges that will be linked in the description, but the first thing we need to do is prep our book. We start by pressing it down using some clamps. I press it between two wooden boards, and these are just some IKEA cutting boards. Then we need to sand the edges to make sure that they're smooth and that we don't get any ink bleeding through the stencil. And after that, we can remove the stencil from the backing paper. If the stencil is too complex, I recommend peeling from the backing paper instead of the transfer tape, because this way you have more control and the stencil is less likely to be lifted from the transfer tape. Now we can apply the stencil to the book and remove the transfer tape. To paint the book, I use a stippling motion, and I like to apply the paint using light coats. Then we need to wait for it to dry, and when it's fully dry, we can remove the stencil. For a more detailed step-by-step, please check the other video that's in the description. And this is the result of the edges after they're painted. At this stage, the stencils are usually ready. If I have any issues in the painting phase, if I notice some elements don't work well, I can make adjustments in this phase too. But these ones are ready now, so now it's time to make the digital version. So after I have the final version of the stencil, I go back to Silhouette Studio so that I can export the digital version. I export it as JPEG, PNG, and SVG files so that they can be purchased and used with your own machine. I'm going to show you how I export SVGs, but please keep in mind that to export SVGs in Silhouette Studio, you need the business edition. To export it, I select the entire design, then go to File, Save Selection, Save in hard drive, and then I select the SVG as the file format. And that's how I design and make the stencils. These are the stencils I designed in this video, and they're now available in my shop if you like to get them. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. If you like this video, please don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. And thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!